Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starr here with you. We're looking at the rise of the Greek city-states today. And as you can see, we're covering a number of I can statements today, looking at just the development of civilization in and around the Mediterranean. We'll be talking about some of the characteristics of the civilization that we're talking about here, specifically ancient Greece and all the different city-states that pop up. And then we'll be talking a little bit about their decline over time here as well, just a bit anyway. And then we'll identify some of the major government types, at least start to get into it today. We'll do more of that later on. All right, so let's take a look. When we look at why Greece was so successful and we see all these major civilizations pop up there, a large part because of the geography. When we look at the geography of Greece, the Balkan Peninsula plays a big role here. And so when we look at the Balkan Peninsula, you've got water on three sides, obviously. It helps shape the civilization for the people. The land itself was divided up by mountains and valleys, and the surrounding islands were extremely rocky and mountainous as well. We also lead to a lot of important waterways around this area, and so we have the Aegean Sea, obviously, as being a big one, the Mediterranean Sea as being large as well. The Dardanelles, which is north of the city Troy on the map there, which leads to the Black Sea. And then obviously you have the Black Sea as well. Lots of important strategic waterways played a major role of the civilizations growing up in this territory. In addition to this, we look at the waterways acting as basically highway routes and trade routes. It was kind of the link to the outside world for the ancient Greek city-states that developed in this area. We also know that because of all the rocky outcrops and islands, that there was a lot of safe harbors, and that led to having a lot of skilled sailors in and around Greece. And so they used those skills that they developed in order to trade with other civilizations as well. And so trade obviously is important. They exported things, sent things around the world like olive oil and wine. We see marble being sent to Egypt and the Middle East as well. So lots of different things being exported from ancient Greece at this time. And then they imported things too. They imported things like grains and metal. And one of the biggest things they imported was ideas. All right. We look at the Phoenician alphabet as being something that came from people around the Mediterranean that was not part of the ancient Greek culture, but they kind of brought on the idea of the Phoenician alphabet as well. When we look at the actual land itself, we said it was very mountainous, lots of valleys and mountains, and that led to a lot of isolated city-states. These little city-states or little towns would develop, and over time they kind of controlled the land around the city as well, and that's where we get the term city-state. And they all became independent over time. They were not unified together. And with those city-states, people had really strong loyalties to their specific city-state. They looked at themselves as being part of Athens or part of Sparta or part of Olympia or wherever those places were, and they fiercely defended their home. All right, they did not identify as Greeks. That really doesn't happen until later on. Something happens that will kind of unite the people together a little bit throughout the Greek peninsula or the Balkan Peninsula. But before that, it was all these city-states that grew up. And what happens a lot of times with all the isolated city-states is we saw a lot of conflict happen. A lot of frequent wars happen between city-states. We'll actually talk later about a very famous war that happens between Athens and Sparta. And so we'll get to that one in a couple days here. The term the polis is referring to the city itself. We can still see that term being used today for city like Minneapolis or Indianapolis. Those cities are still using that ancient Greek terminology of polis, and that just means the city. So right around the year 750 BCE, we start seeing these major polises developing in these isolated valleys, and that's what leads to these city-states. In these city-states, we tended to see two levels develop. We have kind of the upper level, which we call the Acropolis, and that's where all the important buildings would be, like temples or government buildings, public buildings, things like that. And then you've got the flat ground around the city, the rest of the city, and that's where we would have things like marketplaces and homes and different areas that would be obviously not necessarily as important as the ones up on the Acropolis. And we tend to see very small populations in these cities, all right? Not hundreds of thousands of people, but smaller cities, and kind of had this sense of everyone kind of knew each other in these places. There's kind of an artist's rendering of what ancient Athens would have looked like at the height of its power. And so you can see the Acropolis in the background there. But when we look at it, people tend to have this kind of shared responsibility. They looked at themselves as being a close-knit community, and it tended to be kind of a warm climate. not the actual temperature, but the people tended to get along pretty well inside the city-state. And again, they were very loyal to their city-state. They looked at it as kind of a whole community, like it takes a village kind of idea, that everyone was there to work together. When we look at maybe the most famous Acropolis, we can see the one right there in Athens. And on top of that, we have the temple to Athena, or at least what's left of the temple to Athena. And so that building there is called the Parthenon. And it was built to commemorate a great victory in war that Athens had at one point. We'll talk about that a little later on. But you can see there that temple was dedicated to the patron goddess of the city of Athens, and her name was Athena, the goddess of wisdom. All right. A little bit about the government of ancient Greece. We kind of take a look going way back, early government here in early Greece. We talk about 750 BCE up to about 500 BCE. And really everything first off was started to be run by monarchs. Kings were in charge of things. And over time, we start to see this slow shift in power towards the nobles. And that leads to kind of a new development of government. And then eventually the power will start to change and the middle class will appear, and they start to gain more control in government as well. And so we see multiple types of government being utilized by the ancient Greeks. And so with the development of the middle class, we start to see other groups like merchants pop up. Farmers can be included into this middle class area as well. And so over time, they're going to want more power. As those new classes developed, we see new forms of government develop, moving away from a monarchy with a king in charge to kind of what we call an aristocracy, where you've got kind of nobles in charge as well. As they gain more power, you've got more people, kind of the wealthy, rich, elite people in charge at the time. And then eventually we'll see kind of an oligarchy start to pop up. And when we see oligarchy, that's where we see kind of the rise of the middle class a little bit. All right, oligarchy is a government being run by a small group of people, basically. And we'll see changes eventually, because ancient Greece is known as kind of the beginning of democracy, the birthplace of democracy. So down the road, we'll see democracy as well. With the changes in government and the changes in the new classes, or the middle class starting to develop, we start to see changes in warfare in Greece as well. And when we look at this, one of the reasons we see a major change is because the iron tools and weapons are starting to be replaced, or are replacing, bronze tools and weapons. Bronze is extremely heavy, and bronze is extremely expensive. And so as iron becomes more and more prevalent in ancient Greece, we start to see that cheaper tools and cheaper weapons and lighter tools and lighter weapons will be replacing those heavy bronze items. Changes in power in the middle class also lead to a change in warfare styles. You might say, how does that happen? Well, basically, people in the middle class are able to afford more. They have more money. And when they have more money, they can buy more things like tools and weapons. And that means that they now have new fighting people that can emerge as well, meaning people can be in charge of saving or defending their city in times of war. And that's exactly what we see. We see a new style of warfare develop called the phalanx, which you can see pictures of on the right-hand side there. Basically, it depends on each person on the front line, or each man in this case on the front line, having their shield held tightly and guarding the person next to them as well. And it's almost like a almost like an ancient tank. They're able to just kind of slowly move forward with their spears, or their sarissas, as they call them. And they're able to continue to push forward and kind of just tear through anything in front of them. And that, again, citizens are able to afford weapons, and that then makes them perfect for defending their own city. We're going to take a look at two different groups here as we go through life in ancient Greece. We're going to look at the Spartans first, and then we're going to look at the Athenians. The two of them are vastly different than one another, but they basically are kind of the top dogs in ancient Greece when we talk about the city-states. And so when we talk about Sparta first, when we look at the Spartans, they lived in the Peloponnesian part of Greece, which is kind of the southern portion of Greece. When we look at them, they were actually Dorians. We talked a little bit about the Dorians in our myth and real activity. The Dorians were the ones that came in and invaded. Well, these are the ancestors, or the Dorians are the ancestors of the Spartans. And so the Spartans kind of come in, they take over that southern portion of Greece, and they start to grow their city-state to be a pretty good size at the height of their power. They actually came through and conquered people. Right? They did not do things peacefully. In fact, they tend to become kind of a warlike people. And they had a lot of slaves. In any area they conquered, any cities they conquered, they took those people as slaves, and they called them helots. So the slaves in ancient Sparta were called helots. And actually, there are more helots than there are Spartans at the height of the Spartan power as well. And so in order to keep the helots in line and make sure that they didn't rise up and overthrow the Spartans became very militaristic. And they had this kind of warrior culture to make sure that they could keep the people in line. Now, they established this military state, like we said, to keep them in line. Their government was interesting, though. They had two kind of interesting aspects to their government. And so they had two kings at the top of their government. So two different kings. One of them ran the domestic affairs, so the city-state of Sparta itself. The other led and controlled the actual Spartan military. And so those two kings kind of coexisted together. And again, they did this because in times of war, one king could be off fighting the war, the other could be at home taking care of the city-state itself. They also had an assembly of all citizens. And so kind of almost a senate of all these citizens that got together. Now, these citizens had to be male and they had to be landowners. All right, so they were wealthy male landowners at this time, and obviously no helots involved. They were slaves. They were not considered citizens of Sparta. And then finally, the last part they have is this. They call them the 5 ephors, and the ephors were kind of a council of elders. And so if you can take a look, they actually have kind of a separation or a balance of power here in their government. They have kings at the top, they have an assembly of all the citizens, like a legislative body, and then they have the ephors, this kind of elder council that works almost like a judicial branch. So almost kind of like our government today, 3 different branches of government coexisting here. When we look at life in Sparta for men and women, men's life was a little bit different. And so we look at the age of 7, boys actually began their military training. They were taken from their families and plunged into a military training program called the agoge. And so as a result of that, Spartan youth became excellent soldiers, and the Spartan military became excellent as well. There is a clip. We'll see if we have time. I'll throw it on there if we have time to watch it later on here. We look at life of Spartan women, a little bit different. Their main goal was to provide healthy sons for the army. And when we look at women were put through rigorous exercise, they needed to stay fit, stay in shape. Women also were put in charge of the family estates. Women ran the family estates or the family land that they controlled, and they could actually inherit property as well, which is actually somewhat revolutionary for this timeline. And this is largely because if a man went off to war and died, then the woman could continue to run the family estate if he wasn't there. Women were highly educated, so were the men. And so, again, their goal was to provide and create a military. All right. Sparta and its neighbors, they have kind of an interesting relationship with their neighbors. They isolate themselves from everybody. Again, the geography kind of bred isolation, but the Spartans specifically isolated themselves from everyone else. They kind of looked down on the other city-states. They also forbid anyone from trading and traveling with any other city-state as well. All right, so you could not travel to those other city-states. You were basically forced to stay in Spartan lands. As a result of this isolation, the other Greek city-states greatly admired the Spartan military. They thought they were amazing. They were literally probably the greatest or one of the greatest fighting forces in the world at this time. But unfortunately for the Spartans, these rigid ways of their government and these kind of regulations they put on made a lot of times of suffering as well for the people. If they had a bad harvest, there was no trading with other groups or other city-states. They just had to suffer through it, unfortunately. That brings us to Athens, our second of our 2 kind of case studies of these big top dog city-states in ancient Greece, and they're greatly different. When we take a look at Athens, Athens is located north of the Peloponnesus, so they're located in what we call Attica, which is kind of mainland Greece. And when we look at Athens itself, it was originally controlled by noble landowners. They held all the power in ancient Athens, and over time there became an aristocratic government. Those landowners eventually kind of they were in control of everything. They were wealthy, but over time we start to see a shift. And Athens is kind of the birthplace of what we see as democracy. And we'll get into that a little bit here. Athens became wealthy largely because of trade. All right, they traded with other groups, they traded with other people, and they started to gain more and more wealth. They were also much more less warlike, I should say, than Sparta, and much more based on wisdom and wealth and power as they grew in that area. And so merchants and farmers eventually rose to power, as we talked about earlier, with the government changes, and we start to see a shift in the type of government. All right, they resent some of the power of the nobles, and that's when we start to see the development of the oligarchy, which will eventually lead us to a democracy. Lastly, and we're going to take a little bit closer look later on with Sparta and Athens, but lastly, we're going to take a quick look at the religion. You guys might be a little familiar with the religion already from some of the literature you've done in English classes and whatnot. But if we take a look, the Greeks believed in polytheism. They believed in many gods. In fact, we call it Greek mythology today. And they believed that the gods lived on Mount Olympus and that the largest or the king of the gods was Zeus, who's pictured right there. And then you had his wife Hera, and then there's a number of children. That's just a few of the notable ones. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Ares, the goddess of war, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And again, there's other gods and goddesses as well, but those are kind of the most notable ones. But you've probably heard a little bit about them and read a little bit about them in some of the literature you've done in English class. Oh, we've Poseidon there as well. Zeus's brother, Hera's brother, god of the sea. All right, and then we have Hades, god of the underworld as well. So Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades. Sounds weird because Zeus and Hera are married, but they are all brothers and sisters. And then you've got Hera and Zeus's children who become kind of all the other gods and goddesses as well. So wrapping things up, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at those 4 I can statements. I just want you to take a quick look through these. I want you to answer those 4 statements as kind of your summary here. And again, these notes will definitely come in handy later on. So have a good one. We'll see you next time.